Thou shalt not criticise the banks, and the moral scar driving Australia's soldiers to suicide. Coming up on this week's episode of the Citizens Report. Welcome to the Citizens Report. So 26th of September, I'm Robert Barwick and I'm joined today by Citizens Party researcher and writer Richard Bardon. Welcome, Richard.
Thanks, Robbie.
In this week's show, we're going to talk about this absolutely disturbing misinformation and disinformation bill and just how far the government wants to use it to shut down proper critiquing of the banking system and other matters, but we're quite experts in critiquing the banking system. What they're going to do, what they would like to do with this kind of bill will shock you. And we're going to talk about the Royal Commission into veteran suicide, which handed down its report last week, very large report. And Richard has got some very important things to say about it because it covers some important stuff, but raises a very important moral question that Australia needs to own up to. But remember, we put out our information not for information's sake, but because we want to change the things we're talking about, and we need your help to do that. And because you do help, we actually do succeed often in impacting on these issues, thanks to you. And the way you can start on this show is help us get it out. Like the show, subscribe. If you're not a subscriber, remember to ring the bell icon. Share it as widely as you can on social media while you still can. Comment below, please. I read the comments and try and engage as much as I have time for. And there's a donate button below which you can help our efforts by donating as well. Before we begin, just a couple of quick updates, both quite important. First of all, the less serious one, I mean, it's quite serious, but it's more humorous what happened this week. You might have noticed there was a big hullabaloo midweek because the Greens political party made an offer to the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, that it seems he could refuse. The Greens have said, if you want to pass your Reserve Bank of Australia reforms bill, well, here are our conditions. Because remember, the Liberals won't deal with them anymore, thanks to us. And the condition was, use the power of section, there were three actual conditions. Keep section 11, which gives the Treasurer power over the RBA's interest rate decisions. Keep section 36, which of the Banking Act, which gives the RBA power to tell the private banks what they can do with their lending. Doesn't give them the power to tell the private banks to make specific loans to specific companies or borrowers, but it can say, stop lending in this category, or reduce your lending in this category, lend more in this other category. That's the RBA has the power to do that. So keep those two sections. And right now, because a third of Australian households are being crushed, literally crushed, under interest rates as we have them, use your power to cut interest rates. That was the Greens' conditions. That set off all kinds of fireworks all week. And what I want to highlight here, Rich, is that the fireworks confirm that we actually defeated this bill. Because not only is the Labor Party carrying on, they are accusing the Greens of being economic vandals and irresponsible, and how could you possibly think the government should have any say over interest rates, etc. But that's what the power's for. They're decrying the suggestion to use a power that actually exists. So why did wise men 79 years ago put it in there if it's not to be used?
And then less wise but still not stupid men on the Liberal side of things decided not to get rid of it, even though they had tried to prevent it being enacted once they saw how it worked. Or they went, yeah, no, we're going to keep that, definitely. We need to keep that. And then Peter Costello and other modern Liberals, relatively modern Liberals, said the same thing.
And what the point we've been making about this process over the last few weeks is that there's no doubt in the world that Jim Chalmers did have a deal with Angus Taylor to pass this when the review first happened. We got in the way. this process, us sitting at this desk talking to you down YouTube and saying, do something, call for an inquiry, make phone calls, send emails, etc., make submissions to the inquiry, that worked. And we forced the Liberal Party to drop their support for it. And the proof of that is the Liberals also attacked the Greens for making the suggestion. How could you possibly think that? How could you like I saw this one tweet from, what's his name, the former Liberal leader, John Hewson, right, accusing the Greens of all sorts of things. Of this is the height of, just the mere concept is the height of irresponsibility. But the Liberal Party just saved this power that is there for this purpose.
Yeah.
So it proves by their actions that they actually did it reluctantly because we made them.
Yep.
Now, so that was good, and it looks like that the last time we were on the show talking about this, we talked about how the declaration of victory over this RBA reforms bill was almost complete. It had a question mark over the end in pencil, and it's being slowly rubbed out. It's probably still there, but it's almost invisible. All right, another quick update, and this is really sad. Friends of the show, Beryl and Ray Taylor, who are among the 130 victims of the Sterling First Rent for Life scheme, 2 days ago were evicted from their home. And I interviewed Beryl on the Citizens Party's Citizens Insight program back in 2021 when we were campaigning really hard for an inquiry into the Rent for Life scheme collapse and the role of ASIC in particular in its negligence in allowing that collapse. So I interviewed Beryl. Beryl and the other victims of that scheme, they're all elderly people. They have fought really hard for justice in this case because there's a few interesting, unique things about the Sterling case. There's a lot of people who've lost a lot of money in financial collapses over the last 20 years or more. And some of that led to the Royal Commission, etc. Not to criticise them, but there's a certain type of scheme that gets started which detracts people because it's offering something that's too good to be true. That's a get-rich-quick scheme. Oh, you can get this fantastic interest rate, this guaranteed return, etc., etc. The people who went into Sterling were not like that, right? They were not trying to get rich quick.
They weren't trying to get rich at all.
It
wasn't, as far as they were concerned, it wasn't an investment. They weren't looking to make money out of anything.
They were downsizing.
Yeah, downsizing their houses, paying rent for life up front. That's
all
how it was sold to them.
Yep.
That's how it was sold to them.
And the only reason it even existed in the first place is because ASIC did not do its job, and the Western Australian Consumer Affairs Department, not only did it not do its actual job of advocating for the consumer, it detected that the particular product that this Sterling First group was offering did not comply with Western Australia's real estate laws. And instead of saying, oh, we should look more closely at this because you're pitching this at vulnerable elderly people, they said, let us help you make it legal.
Rewrite the terms of it so that it skirted the law that they're supposed to enforce.
We'll rewrite, yeah, exactly. So this scheme had the imprimatur of these two agencies, and it sucked in 130 people before it eventually collapsed. Now, so we've written this up in the alert this week. One of the points that we highlighted from my interview with Beryl back in 2021 is she had explained to us then that she had done her due diligence. Her accountant had suggested she do due diligence, and one of the things she did was call ASIC and say, are there any red flags over this scheme? And what we say in the alert is this: despite the founder of the scheme having been banned by ASIC from being a company director, despite him being discharged from bankruptcy the same year the scheme started, despite his fellow director having been a director of one of the biggest corporate collapses in Australian history that cost investors hundreds of millions of dollars, and despite ASIC having already received multiple complaints about Sterling before Beryl made her inquiry, ASIC told Beryl Taylor there were no red flags. So she and her husband signed up, And the home they've just been evicted from, Richard, from their standpoint, is fully paid for. They paid $160,000 to live in this home, right? They've paid for it. But no, because the scheme was dodgy, right? They've now been evicted. And this is going to keep happening unless the government steps in and compensates these victims because of the government's own failings, both the West Australian government and the federal government.
Yeah.
So we have a press release that we're putting out today about this. We'll put a link below and you can have a look at some of the details on that, and also to our my interview with Beryl back in 2021. All right, let's get into the main program now, Richard. Thou shalt not criticise the banks. And of course, what we're talking about is the Albanese government's MAD bill, Misinformation and Disinformation Bill. I've probably got the full name here somewhere. Communications Legislation Amendment Combating Misinformation, Disinformation Bill 2024. Now, one of the reasons we're talking about it today is, if you might have already seen this on YouTube or social media, because it's getting around everywhere. We had the Citizens Party starts each working day in terms of our office here. We probably have got more people in our head office than the offices of the corresponding major parties, I can tell you. And we have people on Zoom, etc. So we have a morning meeting with, between 20 and 30 people involved in that meeting every morning. And so on Monday morning, we knew that the submissions were open on the Senate inquiry into this bill. But while we're in that meeting, we looked up the committee website, and the committee website had just posted that the submissions closed on the 30th of September, which was 7 days from Monday. And you're going to be watching this maybe from Friday night, Saturday, Sunday, etc. We're talking about Monday evening, the 30th of September. This next week is when the submissions close. It is extraordinary to have a committee inquiry where there's only 7 days allowed for submissions.
Yeah, especially into a bill that's this widely discussed, this controversial, right? They're trying to steamroll this thing.
They are. But I'll tell you what, by doing that, Albo and whoever, let's just blame him. The buck has to stop with him.
Yeah.
He's an idiot. Sorry, because if you ever want to motivate people to pull their finger out and get going, right, do something like this. Because I can tell from the fact that we went out and publicised this straight away, and it's just raced around the country like a wildfire. Everyone started repeating the news that it's only 7 days, and everything I've seen, Richard, every social media reference to this, which is why they want to shut social media down. Let me assure you. Every social media reference to this has people really focused on the urgency, and all the comments below are people saying, I've made my submission, I've made my submission, I've made my submission.
Yep.
Now, if you're watching this on Friday night or Saturday or Sunday or Monday and you have not yet made your submission, you have till Monday night to do it. Don't stop, and make sure you do. Don't take anything we're saying here now as license to say, oh, it looks like enough people have, I'm not going to do it. No, you must make a submission. It can be one sentence, it can be 10,000 words. We don't care. If you have the time and you have the insight to put really considered thoughts down on paper on this, and the links are below where you can find the actual legislation and do all that sort of stuff. If you want to do that, go ahead. That submission is more likely to be published if you do something like that. If you just want to fire off on the record your thoughts as an Australian citizen, go ahead and do that as well. If you're having trouble using the Senate Inquiry website's portal to upload, it's probably because it's being overworked, right? Overwhelmed. So just use the email. Just the email's there, just send it on the email and it'll get there as well. They are going to be so overwhelmed, they're going to come back and say, oh, we can't publish most of these. We're going to treat them as correspondence.
They might even have to delay the reporting date. Wouldn't that be a shame?
They might. One thing we ask is demand in your submission public hearings, because the fact they're only this inquiry is going to report on the 25th of November, and the fact that that's short as well, they're going to probably try and avoid public hearings. Don't let them get away with that, right? Demand public hearings. Now, so let's just go through the provisions of the bill that people need to be most aware of. So before before we get into, I want to give the elaboration of 3 definitions: misinformation, disinformation, and serious harm. That's what the bill comes down to, right? So, and the wording in legalese is all important. So, meaning of misinformation and disinformation. For the purposes of this schedule, dissemination of content using a digital service is misinformation on the digital service if the content contains information that is reasonably verifiable as false, misleading, or deceptive. Reasonably verifiable.
Who decides what's reasonable?
Exactly. We can just do a two-way thing here. Every time you keep pointing out those subjective things, Richard. That's the question. Who decides what is reasonable? Sorry, I've got to point this out. A ends with the word and that's important because they're giving you 3 criteria that it has to meet. A is reasonably verifiable as false, misleading, or deceptive. B, the content is provided on the digital service to one or more end users in Australia. It can just be one. And that, I think that is actually to capture things like Telegram and Signal and anything.
Direct messages, presumably. Otherwise, why put that there?
It can just be one, right? So that's important. And C, the provision of the content on the digital service is reasonably likely to cause or contribute to serious harm.
Yeah. Again, who says what's reasonable?
Who says what is reasonable? And we'll get to serious harm a little bit later. And this is the kicker: the dissemination is not excluded dissemination. So there's a few categories that the bill has of excluded dissemination.
In other words, things that can't be deemed disinformation.
That's
or
right.
misinformation.
And that is if it comes from, they actually say this, something like a comedian in good faith.
Yeah, so satire.
If you're doing a comedy routine, you can just say whatever you like and that's all right. The government, state, federal and local governments, they are excluded. Anything from them is not disinformation or misinformation. And the mainstream media.
Professional news content, I think, is
professional news content. That is not
professional.
So if it's misinformation, if it meets all those criteria. Disinformation adds a little bit more. So it's essentially the same thing. You can see it on the screen there up until D, and then E adds this: either there are grounds to suspect that the person disseminating or causing the dissemination of the content intends that the content deceive another person, or the dissemination involves inauthentic behaviour. Now, so the easy definition of the difference between mis and disinformation is misinformation is sort of accidentally false. Disinformation is deliberately false, right? People know they're deliberately being deceptive, etc.
Lying.
But this dissemination involves inauthentic behaviour. That actually includes things like getting people en masse to use automatic systems, such as in response to this information, such as for sending in submissions to lobby politicians against a bill like this. Now, the thing is, the Citizens Party doesn't do that. We put out the call for people to make submissions, and we always have people come back to us and say, can you give us a template? Can you give us a template? And we've always said, as long as we've been doing this, no, you don't want a template. It's much more powerful if you put it in your own words, right? Because but a lot of politics now, not just in Australia, around the world, uses a system where you can automate, you can program websites, etc., that you go there and you're concerned about an issue, you sign your name, and that generates a whole flood of emails to politicians, etc., in your name, right? And you've only just put in one name. So we don't like doing that. We want, when Parliament engages with something the Citizens Party is involved in, we want them to know that we've actually generated this the hard way, right? Getting people to go to that effort. But it's not like that's illegitimate, right? It just is going to be a little bit more discounted. But they're actually trying to say that kind of thing comes under this definition of inauthentic behaviour in the bill, right? That's actually not legitimate. But as we've already said, it's going to come down to what is reasonably verifiable. And that's a very subjective thing, which means it comes down to someone's opinion. But then this is the kick, and I want to come back to this in a little bit. The note at the end of the disinformation section says this: disinformation includes disinformation by or on behalf of a foreign power.
Now, why would that need to be in there at all?
Well, because I know why. I'm convinced, as we wrote in the alert, I'm convinced that is the overwhelming motivation for all this. Now, they've used it, they've decided to throw a whole bunch of other things on the bus to catch, which we're talking about, such as the criticism of the banks. We'll elaborate on in a second. But ultimately, this law has its origins in this kind of paranoia about what foreign powers are doing to us, right? Even though there is plenty that foreign powers are doing to us, but it depends on who the foreign power is. All right, and then this is the really bizarre stuff. Meaning of serious harm. For the purpose of this schedule, serious harm is harm to the operation or integrity of a Commonwealth, state, territory, or local government electoral or referendum process. Now, Richard, the fact that they come up with this so soon after the Voice referendum shows you actually that this is quite self-serving from this government. The Voice referendum embarrassed them. They wanted to shut down. They would have liked, if they could have, to shut down any criticism of the Voice. I remember the first conversation I had in this office here about the Voice. We weren't opposed to the Voice as a knee-jerk ideological reaction to the Voice, right? But it was like, okay, what's this thing going to be? And the more people asked questions, the more they were getting non-answers, right? And then, of course, all sorts of wild claims started going around. But the government couldn't counter those wild claims because they couldn't even counter the legitimate questions.
Yeah, it refused to say what it was going to do, and so everybody assumed the worst because, frankly, why wouldn't you?
Exactly. It was this paradox. This thing was nothing to worry about, right? It was because it was not going to do anything, but it was going to be so powerful it could close the gap between Aboriginals and the rest of Australians. So it was either a non-thing or it was the most powerful change to the Constitution ever. And these competing ideas, just the government never reconciled that, right?
Because nature abhors a vacuum, including information vacuums, and they created it.
Exactly. Now, on this point, I've got to inject here. I won't name the person, but I happen to know a former Labor politician who was the leader of his state. He was actually the premier of his state. Let's say that. I know this guy. And I said to him, the day I first met him, I said, because I decided to ask him a challenging, more philosophical question. I said, when you're dealing with an issue where there's a sizable section of the population, even if it's a minority, but it's sizable, that has a view on an issue that you think is completely wrong, completely false, even bizarre, but it's sizably held by a section of the population. Do you, as the leader in your communication, speak to that and actually try and persuade those people what is false about what they think? Or do you just ignore that and just focus on what you define the truth to be and just speak to that? And this person, who I don't think is an unreasonable person, but I think he's a typical Labor politician, he said to me, "Nah, you can never talk to that stuff. You just talk to what you know is true. Ignore it." And I said, well, you ignore it, you're not going to ever, put them straight. If you can't speak to a sizable section of the population, if you think they've got misinformation in their minds and you can't debunk it, well, you're just going to make it worse. But that was the attitude, and I think that shows you where Labor Party. I don't want to single Labor out. The Liberals actually started this process, but they look like they're opposing this. I think that's sort of the example where Labor actually doesn't want to. Labor is so much of a vacuum itself in terms of policy, right? It's got nothing to engage with in debates, and so it is really motivated to shut them down. All right. Anyway, so we're talking about what harm is. So that was the first definition. Second, B, harm to public health in Australia, including to the efficacy of preventive health measures in Australia. And we all know what that means. That's actually going to be very alarming to a lot of people. There were fierce debates during the COVID pandemic, right? And the governments, as a knee-jerk thing, denounced all the questions as misinformation, disinformation. But that was in the heat of the moment, and when they had enormous powers and used them. Now, it's not that long since the pandemic has sort of receded. There is quite a shift in the consensus on some of these matters, right? Even Dr. Nick Coates, the first Deputy Chief Health Officer, who helped to advocate for, say, the vaccine, I saw him come out yesterday completely condemning this bill for trying to shut down debate on such matters. And even if all the people are wrong, Richard, who are questioning these matters, do you think a government actually gets anywhere by shutting down their ability to question it? Is that persuasive at all? Has it ever been in history when you say, okay, you can't talk about that? Yeah. Does that persuade anybody?
It persuades them that there must be something to it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And if these clowns don't know that, I mean, these are, as we talked about in the alert, the essence of this debate about free speech has been debated for centuries.
Thousands of years.
Thousands of years. How do you deal with these kind of matters? And the actual historical consensus by the wise people, the disinterested people, I mean the people that are not there to try and pursue their own power and therefore talk their own book in a sense, is, look, it doesn't work. Censorship doesn't work.
Yeah.
If you don't know censorship doesn't work, that the thing that you want, that the thing you think is wrong, that if people share it will make them believe a whole heap of rubbish, if you think that suppressing that deals with it, you're an idiot, right? This is just civics 101. All right. C, vilification of a group in Australian society distinguished by race, religion, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, intersex status, disability, nationality, or national or ethnic origin, or vilification of an individual because of a belief that the individual is a member of such a group. Is part of this definition of serious harm. In other words, it's a catch-all. Everything's included, and so people can say, "Oh, I'm being harmed by that information, therefore it's got to be shut down," right? And
if somebody decided it was reasonable to assume it was false.
If somebody decided that.
Somebody. You don't know who.
I used the example, I was on Martin North and John Adams' show, and I used the example that in the current debate over, the public debate in Australia over the war in Israel and Gaza, there is the leading Zionist organisations in this country, like the Zionist Federation of Australia, that's actually trying to use that sort of power that's in the Racial Vilification Act against Mary Kostakidis. They're actually trying to say that the people advocating for Gaza are guilty of anti-Semitism against them. So they're saying we, Australians who are in the Zionist movement, are the victims of people in Australia who are advocating that children in Gaza shouldn't be bombed, right? And who, some bureaucrat will get to decide if that's reasonably true or not. And depending on their point of view, that sort of thing can get shut down. And this is how dangerous it is. And then, there's, D is intentionally inflicting physical injury to an individual in Australia. I mean, that's no-brainer.
Yeah, that's captured under existing laws. It's called assault, battery, murder, whatever.
Exactly. And not just that, incitement. We have
incitement,
laws against incitement.
Incitement to violence.
That are applied when governments feel the need to apply them. Imminent damage to critical infrastructure or disruption of emergency services. Again, incitement, right? This is more black and white stuff.
But also imminent, as in about to happen.
About to happen.
Who decides that it's about to happen?
Well, then that brings us to the big one. Imminent harm to the Australian economy, including harm to public confidence in the banking system or financial markets. And they've elaborated that, that has significant far-reaching consequences for the Australian community or a segment of the Australian community, or severe consequences for an individual in Australia. Now, that section on the banking system and financial markets, Richard, was not in the original draft of this bill.
No.
They have inserted that, and that is just mind-blowing. They want a system here where you cannot criticise the banks if they decide that this is capable of causing imminent harm, i.e. before the fact, to the banking system.
And to an individual. What's severe harm to an individual? Does that include maybe a lying bank executive getting fired because they lied to the Senate? Because that happened multiple times in this inquiry. In bank branch closures that we've been banging on about for all these years.
Well, get this. So the explanatory memorandum, which is important with a bill like this, you get the bill, and that's all in legal language. Then you get the explanatory memorandum. It's example of the justification for that section is this. In March 2023, posts on social media regarding the financial health of Silicon Valley Bank, this is in America, California, went viral. And in response, customers withdrew $42 billion in just a few hours. Silicon Valley Bank was placed under receivership the following day. Research into the events leading up to Silicon Valley Bank's failure found that Twitter, now X, was the driving force behind the financial panic that ultimately led to the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank. And then it says that research found that while not all tweets were false, misleading or deceptive, there were, quote, unequivocal examples of the propagation of misinformation during the run on Silicon Valley Bank. So, hang on. Was Silicon Valley Bank in trouble or not?
I mean, it was basically a shambling corpse.
Yeah.
Somebody caught on to the fact and said, hey, this thing's a goner, get out if you can. And everyone went, hell, you're right.
Yeah.
And so they got out while they could.
And it raced around social media. But you know what? It's not like bank runs started in the social media age.
No, I mean, has anybody seen Mary Poppins?
Exactly.
Except that bank wasn't a dead duck. This thing was. And people, they were doing all sorts of dodgy things. They didn't have money they said they had. This was basically a criminal enterprise.
This bank was in trouble.
It was a basket case every way you looked at it. And as soon as people looked at it, they realised that and they pulled their money out.
But they have acknowledged that the tweets, quite a few of the tweets, were correct.
Yeah.
But because some were incorrect. So how did bank runs happen in the old days? Well, someone caught wind that something was happening at the bank, right? And so the word spread like word of mouth. And people in the city centre would see everyone start thronging towards the bank. It would normally start with a queue outside the bank, right? And then everyone knows. And then as you get further away from the city centre, some bloke starts running down his street, and some lady calls out the window, "Where you going, Sam? I heard the bank's in trouble," right? And then in that process, any one of those claims spreading by word of mouth might not have been factually quite accurate. But obviously some were, right? The bank was in trouble, people would have a run on the bank. That's how it works. The idea that this is new and therefore a unique problem to social media is just bizarre. But here's the more serious part about this, Richard. The way this bill is supposed to work is you're not going to get arrested for sharing the information about that. That's not what this bill's about. This bill is actually going to put all the onus on the social media companies to make sure it doesn't get shared.
Yeah.
No one's going to get arrested over this bill, over this law, right?
No.
The social media companies have to decide what is reasonably verifiable as misinformation or disinformation before the fact.
Yep.
Because if you think about this in real time, they won't be able in real time to assess something like that that's happening so quickly. Unlike, say, if there was, say the kind of warnings that we were putting out about the global financial system before 2008. Our party was putting out warnings saying derivatives, look at the growth of derivatives, they're going to bring down the system, right? And because there's a slow burning fuse there, social media companies might say, oh, that may be true or that may be not true, we're going to suppress that information. That's dealing with something that's happening on a slower time frame. When you're dealing with something like this, they won't have time to reasonably assess it or not. And what they'll be worried about, even if they don't have their own nefarious motives, what they will be worried about is, we can't afford to have anything like that. So preemptively, social media companies will implement systems that shut down all discussions about the banks.
Yeah, and that's the intention of wording this bill as vaguely as it is.
Exactly. And what have we done over the last 6 years, and especially over the last 4 years, that's finally forced the government to look at starting a postal bank because the pressure out there is overwhelmingly enormous? What have we done? Non-stop criticise the banks. On social media, this has been a very important tool for the Citizens Party to get our message out, right? And if you come up, if they have to design algorithms that just shut down all that discussion so that all you're left sharing on social media is cat videos, and even then, God help them if they're AI ones that are not true, right? What they've effectively brought is the whole of the social media, I hate this term, don't judge me, ecosystem.
No, that's apt. That's actually what it means.
Oh, good. Back under government mainstream media control. Because right now, social media, because the technology has moved so rapidly from nowhere, social media allows the mass dissemination of ideas and information that is outside of government social media control. Corporate mainstream media control. Before social media came along, if you couldn't get your ideas covered in the press, you had to do what the Citizens Party did, go and start your own press.
Yeah.
Right? You raise money, you publish a newspaper or a magazine, you get it printed, you spend weeks and months distributing around Australia, from the late 80s until the mid 2010s, our party put out dozens and dozens and dozens of issues of our New Citizen newspaper, and some of those had print runs of 1 million copies. Quite a few had print runs of 1 million copies. Very expensive to do. That's how we got our information out.
Well,
right?
I mean, I can say I personally drove almost a ton of newspapers from here to Darwin once.
There you go.
To distribute there. So
that's the effort we went to.
That was the hard way.
Social media allows, so in 2019, the government announced its policy to ban cash transactions over $10,000. I went on a discussion with Martin North about it when it was just breaking news and everyone had just heard about it and it was really raw and it was the perfect time. We did a discussion on what the bill was about. It got 180,000 views in a few days. And we told those people, make submissions, etc. And we broke all kinds of records on submissions to that. A record that stood until this bill, actually. Similar process, this bill. I think we got about 6,000 submissions to the exposure draft on that bill in 2019. This bill in 2023, its exposure draft had about 23,000 submissions, right? And this Senate inquiry is going to have a lot more. They want to shut all that down. That is what they want to shut down. So that's the bank stuff. A few weeks ago, you, Richard, and Elisa did a show where you talked about Crybaby Common, Matt Common. The last time Matt Common was at a government hearing, he spent his whole time whining about the information that's going around out there about banks and corporations. He says, I think this sort of continuing, often fact-free rhetoric that is being published more broadly is very damaging. I say damaging insofar as I think it's really eroding trust in our institutions. He said, but I just see too often now, particularly in the external environment, claims made that are demonstrably not true. I think that's weakening and driving a fundamental distrust about citizens. You must be seeing it. We are seeing it. I think it's a real cause of concern. And what he's complaining about is the claim that banks make their profits by gouging people. He says, I don't think the right thing is to position things when they're factually incorrect. He says, I think it's a real concern that will drive a fundamental distrust over the next decade, which I think should be a cause for real concern. He said, this is what he said. He said, I think Australia is a very special place, which we have inherited from others, and it relies on the rule of law being upheld and on a sense of trust, civility, and community sentiment. That's why Australia responds to lockdowns and vaccinations. It's very unlike many other countries and economies. The internet has obviously accelerated misinformation, but I see too often that there's not enough onus put on people who are furnishing what they describe as facts, but are demonstrably false. So we posed the question this week, is he behind this bill as well?
Well, he keeps saying demonstrably false, but he doesn't demonstrate that they're false. And if he's fact-free, well, only in the sense that not every accusation comes with a list of detailed facts, but those facts do exist. We've published them about why he's lying and why we know they're gouging.
Yep, and we're part of the process that's put them under unprecedented public scrutiny. they haven't had these banks have been the master of the universe until the last few years in the lead up to the Royal Commission and afterwards. And finally, people want accountability. And we're the ones that are leading the fight for that, and they really don't like it, and they're targeting social media. One last thing quickly, which I referenced before. If we think the stakes are high on some of these issues we've already discussed, let's go back to the foreign question. Because one thing we do on this show is we talk about information, it's often when Richard's on the show, where we're discussing an alternative view of the world, and especially in relation to Australia's foreign policy. Because we say we don't have an independent foreign policy, we're just marching in lockstep with the United States and the United Kingdom. We've handed over our country to the United States to set it up as a military base for their war against China, which is not in our interest. And we think this is wrong, and we are putting out the information to persuade the Australian public that this is wrong. But 8 years ago, Richard, in 2016, Donald Trump campaigned for President of the United States, and he was saying something that was sort of similar in relation to America's attitude towards Russia. And he took a position, at least in his campaign rhetoric, that was completely at odds with the prevailing attitude. And everyone remembers that. And the establishment made it clear in the way they reacted to that. There's no way they were going to let the democratic will of the American people change that foreign policy. Because as soon as he got elected, they flew into this blizzard of disinformation themselves to say, no, this is not a legitimate election. Putin interfered in the election. Russia hacked the election.
Whatever that means.
Exactly. And they did everything, and it worked. Everything they did to push back against that election of Donald Trump allowed them, if there was any, it's now a question mark in our minds how
how genuine he ever was in the first place.
Yeah, how genuine he ever was. I mean, I think there's probably a little bit there, who knows, but it got easily derailed, and this was the way they derailed it. Because objectively what he ended up doing towards Russia was just as bad as any of his predecessors, right? That's what Putin has said publicly as well. But they used this process to stop it. And actually what they did by doing it is they cast doubt on the information that was being distributed around social media. Oh, that's all Russian disinformation. And in Australia, we're being told that's all Chinese disinformation. And right there is what I think is actually the stakes are much bigger, because if we actually don't get some change in foreign policy, we're talking about a spiral down to something that could end up in nuclear war. Right? That's the real issue. All right, so the stakes are very high. Make sure you make your submission before Monday evening, the 30th of September. Let's kill this bill. The Liberals so far are sounding like they're opposed to it. We have to make sure that's the case. It's going to come down probably to whether the Greens do a deal with the government on this, and we'll give you instructions after this week is over on how to target members of Parliament to make sure that they don't vote for this bill. And I think we can defeat it. All right. We didn't want to go actually that long, Richard, but we have. So let's go to the next subject, because that's where I've got some questions for you. The moral scar driving Australian soldiers to suicide. And this is a disturbing subject, but it's something that Australia as a whole needs to own up to. So you've written a very important article this week. Veterans Suicide Royal Commission avoids the main question: why does Australia go to war? The report of this Royal Commission is huge. Just briefly, what does it address?
So there's been, for many years now, and as the Royal Commission itself said in its opening statements, there's been multiple inquiries into the high suicide rate among serving and former Australian soldiers, sailors, airmen, ADF personnel generally. And so, there have been more than, they said, 50 inquiries and reviews into this subject, relevant to this subject. There's been 750 recommendations plus out of those reviews. Very few have been actioned, as they say, and the results have been, but they don't even measure the results, right? So But basically it boils down to, we send people to war, we have this recruitment pitch about, serving the country and all of these things, which is fine, but then they open with a quote from, they don't name the person, but it's an ex-Air Force serviceman. It says, nothing will take away what it does to a person to literally sign a piece of paper to say they will go anywhere at any time and do anything, including sacrificing their own life in defence of our country, and then for that country to turn around and say to them that they are not worth anything to them broken, they're not worth anything to them injured, that they see me as nothing. And that's the issue here.
Yeah. How bad's the problem?
So, according to their figures, there's been over 2,000 suicides among veterans, serving and former personnel since between 1985 and 2021. An average of 3 a fortnight over the last 10 of those years. But they say these figures are understated for various reasons. There's incomplete data from before 1985. There's...
but does 3 a fortnight over the last 10 years, does that indicate a bit of an acceleration in the rate?
Yeah, as do the suicide rate among serving personnel is actually even higher than among former personnel. So it's getting worse, despite all of these reviews and supposed processes to try and stop it.
Now, before I read your article, because I assigned you to read the report, and it's all right, and I know you weren't even, the report's so big,
The report's over 3,000 pages. I could only read the first.
But before I read it, I had an assumption that a defining factor in this would be related somehow to PTSD. And it turns out there's something much more significant than that, which is this. So what is this concept of moral injury that the report raises?
Okay, so the term was coined by an American psychiatrist working for their veterans, the Veterans Affairs equivalent over there, with Vietnam veterans, who of course these are mostly conscripts. They were sent to fight a war that the causes that they were lied to about the reasons for, saw and had to do horrible things, and then got thrown on the scrap heap when they came home. Exactly as this ex-RAF guy says in here. So Daniel Shea, this psychiatrist's name was, he said that according to Dr. Shea, it says moral injury is present when there has been a betrayal of what's right, that is what's conceived and thought of as what's right under your normal moral code. B, either by a person in legitimate authority or by oneself, and C, in a high-stakes situation. And other researchers in the field describe moral injury as what can happen when a person perpetrates, fails to prevent, or bears witness to acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. That these are likely to be intense and long-lasting effects with emotional, psychological, behavioural and spiritual effects. And then they quote, again, an unnamed former Australian serviceman who says, I don't see many people with suicidal ideation, that is thoughts and planning for suicide, suicidal behaviour. I don't see many people with suicidal ideation that want to kill themselves because of their post-traumatic stress. It's been described by people, this moral injury. I feel like I have a wounded soul, that I've done something really wrong, or I witnessed something that was really wrong, and I didn't do anything about it. And this is my life experience. These are the things that lead to veteran suicide, end quote. And then the Royal Commission's report lists conditions where this happens as lack of leadership accountability, lack of procedural fairness in military justice processes, and a perceived gap between what a policy says and what actually occurs.
And that's why in this article, you've raised the case of David McBride. Yeah. Because David McBride actually acted.
Yeah, he is exemplary of this, this question, what they just described there, because this is a guy, he saw what was happening in Afghanistan. He was a military lawyer assigned to represent special forces. He sees how hotshot prosecutors out to make a name for themselves, or just various political bullshit was how he described it. And he discussed that. People can go and watch the interview that he did with you on our sister program here, Citizens Insight. But So people are being fitted up for crimes they didn't commit, upstanding soldiers, conscientious soldiers, while a chosen few actual war criminals are running around, rampaging about, murdering people with impunity, threatening intelligence officers and other people, threatening their lives on base. Yep. Everything's getting whitewashed, covered up by the brass. They know all about it and claim they don't. David McBride is the guy in jail.
Yeah. Well, and can I let's just cite one case. So the most famous, or probably the most well-known example of an actual war crime from Afghanistan was that everyone saw the video of the Australian soldier standing over the Afghan boy in a field, and he said, "Can I drop him?" Or whatever.
Do you want me to drop him?
Do you want me to drop him?
That's the sanitised version.
And just shot him dead. And this was off the body cam of another soldier. You could see it actually happening. That happened back in 2012, something like that.
Somewhere around then, yeah.
It all came out 2020, 2019, 2020, something like that, right? Thanks to the process that David McBride set in train. But if you're one of that group of soldiers in that troop, or whatever the company, whatever it's called, that's doing that deployment that day, you know that's happened.
Yeah.
Right? You know something wrong has happened. That is the definition of creating this moral injury you've talked about. David McBride, thanks to what he did, it's only thanks to what he did that this stuff started to see the light of day.
And he described in your interview and in many others that he himself became suicidal at being forced to participate in this cover-up before he decided to hell with this. Yeah. I'm going to blow the lid on this thing, and so he took the information and he gave it to the media, and you know. And
I'm glad you said that because and this is what people need to understand about David McBride, because he was in that frame of mind that Richard just said. When the ABC, just before his sentencing, when Four Corners decided to do a hit job on him to make him look like he deserved to go to jail, that he wasn't really a war crimes whistleblower. They could go back and find stuff on him, right? Because he didn't handle it perfectly. They could go back and find stuff on him to make it look bad on TV.
Or just misrepresent his work as an army lawyer, representing people because that was his job, to represent them in courts martial and so forth.
They would have, if David McBride hadn't have done what he did, which involved breaking the law to bring a greater truth to light, he probably would have committed suicide. And the fact he's in jail means that the Australian system, the Australian politicians, from Mark Dreyfus, who could have stopped the whole court case against him, from the ABC journalists who decided they would have preferred he committed suicide.
Yeah.
That's where our country's at on this. And that brings me, Richard, to the final point, because you put this in a context which is not now about the Defence Force, it's about all of us. Your argument is the biggest moral injury stems from the big decisions of why we go to these wars in the first place.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you look at what the Commission cited, the gap between what a policy says and what actually occurs, that's all our wars in living memory outside of World War II, where we were actually defending ourselves. And most of the wars, pretty much all the wars before that as well. Yep. At best, they were nothing to do with us and we should have stayed out of them. Everything since 1945, post-World War II, has been based on lies. Vietnam, Iraq twice, Afghanistan, Syria, where we bombed soldiers who were defending civilians against ISIS and then said, oops.
We killed 70 Syrian soldiers defending people against ISIS.
I wonder if that's what some of these people, if that is the incident that some of these people are talking about. We'll never know because they're quoted anonymously. But,
we were 20 years in Afghanistan, and while we were there for 20 years in Afghanistan, opium production went up. Yeah. Protected by our presence. Yeah. Australia, Britain, the United States. And where was that opium ending up? Killing millions of people in opioid crises in places like America.
Yeah. And,
soldiers aren't dumb, are they?
No, these are not stupid people, especially the special forces. You don't get into there unless you're the brightest, at least in some respects.
Except for
a couple of guys we could name. But no, very, very, very sharp within that, parameters. But in any case, delusion is a different question,
That's true.
But no, so that moral injury these specific soldiers that have gone through this, and many have suicided, others have survived to talk about it and blow the lid on it, blow the whistle on it in David McBride's case. But this applies to the nation as a whole as well. We have this gap, yawning chasm between what we get told our wars are for: freedom, democracy, communist conquest, domino effect, nonsense. They lied. Malcolm Fraser said, he was defense minister, the CIA lied to him about what was happening and who was doing it to get us in there, right? Had he known what he later learned, we would not have been involved in that.
And remember, that was all exposed in the Pentagon Papers.
Yeah, and weapons of mass destruction that they made up to justify invading Iraq. Afghanistan was at least authorised, the original invasion, the 20-year occupation wasn't. So we keep doing this stuff, we keep stepping on the same rake, as the Russians say.
And making money for people.
And
military industrial
making a
complex.
mozza for the military industrial complex. The general who was in charge of the whole show at the time was Governor General until just recently, untouchable, still untouchable.
Hasn't had to hand back his medals.
No, and so this is what this country does. The leaders of this country, it's like there's something that takes over their brains, whether they're decent people or not when they go in, who knows? I can't read minds, thank God. But it's like they get taken over, possessed by something that, that makes them act in what they get told is the national interest, that's really the empire's interest. We're a colony of this British/Anglo-American empire. And all these people, not just the people who volunteer for the military, all of us, every one of us, which is what this stuff with the banks is all about too, because they're part of the imperial superstructure.
Yep.
And we're only useful, we're only important insofar as we're useful, I should say, to that system and to the people in charge of it.
I want to end by putting on the screen this image of David McBride with Julianne Finney, who I've met I met Julianne at the David McBride hearing, actually, and she's holding a photo of her son, who is one of the ADF personnel who has committed suicide in the last 10 years. And then we'll put up the tweet which she did on the day the Royal Commission report was handed down, and she's there with the actual Veterans Affairs Minister, who Matt Keir, who actually she's been going after quite a lot on Twitter, but those images in front of them are actually photos of people like her son who have committed suicide. After the report was handed down, Julianne went from Canberra to Geelong, where the Defence Minister Richard Marles' office is, and she actually staked out his office to protest. She was there for a couple of days protesting this lack of real will to address this. And her message is, don't enlist until it's fixed, because she's the grieving mother of one of the people that's been affected by this, and she's morally courageous enough to know that this is not just something that can be swept under the carpet. This means there's something rotten in the state of Denmark, or in this case, Australia, right? And it's got to, and I think you've nailed it, Richard. It starts with us as a nation saying, why do we keep sending our best and brightest over to fight immoral, illegal wars, and don't expect there's going to be consequences? All right, on that note, thanks very much, Richard, for joining us on the show today.
Thanks, Robbie.
Remember, this all relates to this misinformation, disinformation question. These are the big debates they would like to shut down. So we have a chance to do something about it. Your role is to put in a submission by the 30th of September. Otherwise, thanks to the viewer for tuning in, and stay tuned for more on the Citizens Report.
Authorised by Robert Barwick, Citizens Party, Melbourne.